Hello, everyone. Today we're talking about Elizabeth, her parliament, and the Puritan opposition which existed inside of it. Our learning objective is to look at how the Puritans tried to cause problems for Elizabeth in parliament, and your starter is to answer the question, which is actually quite a big one. Why did Elizabeth need a parliament if she was the Queen of England? So we often look at Elizabeth as being this all-powerful monarch who could do whatever she wanted, but she couldn't. She actually needed Parliament, and your job is to write down why she needed Parliament. So please do take a moment now, title, learning objective, and starter, answer it as best you can. It's a really big question. It's not as simple as a yes or no. We really have to investigate the actual role of Parliament. And you might remember some sources that we've looked at previously to do with MPs and their freedom of speech, and we discussed the specific role that they had, something to do with saying yes and no. So please do take some time, complete your title, LO, and starter. When you're finished, we'll go ahead and take up the starter together. You can resume playing then. So why did Elizabeth need a parliament? Well, we're going to be writing down the red facts for our starter. So everything else is just a bit extra. We're going to focus on the red text. So there were two primary functions of parliament. They were legislation, which is creating laws, and there was taxation, which was raising, generating, and collecting taxes. Now, Elizabeth didn't have the right to pass laws entirely on her own, and she didn't have the right to collect taxes on her own. She needed Parliament's approval to do this. Now, Elizabeth decided when to summon Parliament and when she could dismiss it. Now, she could reject any law that she wanted to, but she had to have the Crown's consent as well as that of the two houses. Now, she did this on 13 occasions where she called Parliament to meet. So if we look at her entire time as Queen from 1559 until 1603, she only called Parliament on 13 occasions. So it's once, every kind of 4 years or so. The belief was widespread that the crown should finance ordinary expenses from permanent revenue sources. So that means Elizabeth was to pay for the running of the country out of her own money. And we would never expect our prime minister to do that today. And it was a bit wild that it was expected of Elizabeth to do this. So she would have to use customs, so money that she collected from taxation, from people abroad, from rents on royal lands as well. Taxes raised by Parliament were for emergencies only, and they were not for her to use. She could raise money for war, which they did vote in favour of on several occasions against Spain and Ireland, but that money often wasn't enough. So Elizabeth had to sometimes sell her own land and property just to be able to run the country. Elizabeth turned to some what we call dubiously legal, they were a bit gray area, means of increasing revenue. So she would leave positions of bishops open and she would pocket their salaries. She wouldn't actually pay for a bishop in High Wycombe. She would say, yeah, the job's filled, and she would take the salary for herself. She also had Francis Drake as a privateer going around causing havoc in the Spanish Main, and she was taking a cut of those profits. Another royal money-making scheme was to issue monopolies. And this is where one person had the sole rights to develop a particular product. So playing cards, we've discussed in the past, playing dice, they were also two commodities that Elizabeth issued a monopoly on and said, only you are allowed to make playing cards in England. That's a great way for a company to make a lot of money, but for Elizabeth to also develop a lot of revenue in terms of those taxes. There were other issues as well, measures against religious dissent, so people who were opposing her, the Catholic threat, vagabonds. All of these sorts of laws passed really easily through Parliament because they were generally quite popular. It wasn't a case of Puritans refusing to help her. Puritans didn't want vagrants or vagabonds around. They didn't want the Catholics invading England. So they were happy to pass those laws, even though they might not fundamentally agree with Elizabeth on her religious views. So I know that was a lot of talking for me. We'll go ahead and let you pause the video in a moment, write down any of those red facts you might have missed. When you're done, resume playing. Now we're looking at the pesky, potentially problematic Puritans. If you want to pause the video and try to say that 5 times fast, you might entertain those around you. We need to know that although Puritans did not challenge Elizabeth's direct claim to the throne, they weren't really associated with a foreign power, and they didn't try to kill her like the Catholics. They were actually quite difficult to deal with, and many of them were wealthy MPs and sat in Parliament. So a question we often get asked is, why didn't Elizabeth just fire these Puritan MPs? And another question students often ask is, how could she actually control the Puritans in Parliament if they're so wealthy and so influential? And those are two great questions for you to start to think about now. Nothing we need to write in our books, but things we're just going to have a moment to pause and reflect upon. And when you're ready with your thoughts, go ahead and resume playing. So that first question, what would happen if Elizabeth just started randomly firing Puritan MPs? And it's the same question we ask, what if Hitler just started killing people randomly? We know that it's very easy for people in positions of power to have people turn against them if they start behaving in ways that aren't seen as appropriate. Elizabeth could be viewed as a tyrant. She could be deposed if she just starts firing these MPs. She could be seen as persecuting those who are of a similar faith to her. So she can't just fire them. She needs to get them on her side. And that's how she's going to control these Puritan MPs in Parliament. We learned a term called patronage. She would use patronage by giving out fancy royal titles and land, offering people special favors to go and help Elizabeth with her policies and stay on her side. Elizabeth could also control their freedom of speech, and we've looked at a source previously that details this very accurately. It said that MPs could say yes or no to bills, but they were not there to speak of all things that came into their minds, such as religions or new governments. So we know that by limiting the freedom of speech of MPs, Elizabeth could further control them in Parliament and stop them from causing her any more trouble. So here we have two readings for us to look at. First on this slide, the next will come in a moment. I would like you just to summarize who Walter Strickland was and what he did, and use the reading to identify who John Field and Thomas Wilcox were and what they did as well. So pause the video, write your summaries of each of those men, and when you're finished, you can resume playing. And just like previously, we're going to look at Peter Wentworth and Anthony Cope, and we're going to write a little summary of what the two men had in common. And then we're also going to write a little summary about what Christopher Hatton and his views towards Peter Turner were like. So why did he not like Mr. Turner? So you can go ahead and pause the video again, write your summaries, and when you're finished, resume playing. So now it's time to add to the note that we've already started. We need to write down freedom of speech and record the information beneath and the Privy Council. So it's important for us to know that Puritan MPs did challenge Elizabeth over freedom of speech. One such man's name was Peter Wentworth. On two occasions, I guess he didn't learn the first time, on two occasions he stood up in the House of Commons and he tried to talk about a lack of freedom of speech among MPs. Anthony Cope was another guy very similar. He tried on one occasion as well to challenge the lack of freedom of speech in Parliament, and both of them were promptly locked up in the Tower of London. Elizabeth, she also faced challenge from Puritans in the Privy Council. One of her most powerful advisors was a Puritan. His name was Sir Francis Walsingham. He was the spy master. And we often regard him as, one of the most loyal Privy Councillors to Elizabeth. He was able, for the most part, to put his religious views aside and help the Queen objectively, but he was still a Puritan. He still disagreed with her on several issues. Robert Dudley, it was rumored that he and Elizabeth had a relationship, nothing to be confirmed, but there were rumors. He was a relatively moderate Puritan as well, who hoped to encourage Elizabeth to introduce more change into the church. So let's go ahead and make a few notes about the freedom of speech, as well as the Privy Council. And then we'll come back and we'll look at source J together. So having a look at our source, we can see it at the very bottom of our screen. It says, "For freedom of speech, Her Majesty commands me to say that no man shall be afraid to say yes or no to bills, but he is not there to speak of all things that come to his mind, to suggest new religions or governments." She said that no monarch fit to rule would ever allow something so stupid. And this was said by the Lord Keeper in a petition for Parliament to get more freedom of speech. Now, the Lord Keeper is a representative of the Queen in Parliament because she can't actually go into the House of Commons. It's called the House of Commons because it's for common people, and the Queen is not a common person. So this is a source we're going to take a very close look at in just a moment. So here we're looking at our source. So let's have a look. What we want to do is break apart the source into some more manageable chunks. So we'll look at what he means when he says, "For freedom of speech, Her Majesty commands me to say that no man shall be afraid to say yes or no to bills." He's not there to speak of all things that come into his mind. What does he mean when he talks about new religions and governments? And Elizabeth says, no monarch fit to rule would ever allow something so stupid. So we've got to look at those individual statements in isolation and just try to figure out what is our Lord Keeper trying to tell us. Now, when we're approaching this question, we need to do it in three different stages. We need to make a judgment about the accuracy of the source. Does it make sense based on what I already know about the role of Parliament? What are the strengths and limitations? What's kind of good or not so good about it? We're referring to the authorship mainly, so who wrote it or who is saying it. And lastly, our final judgment. We just have to reiterate that judgment a second time. So looking back at our source, when he says, for freedom of speech, Her Majesty commands me to say. So this is like saying, in regards to your ability to talk about whatever you want, guys, the Queen told me to tell you that you can say yes or no to laws. Don't be afraid to say yes or no to a law. But the Queen told me to also say, you can't talk about whatever you want in Parliament. You can't talk about things like religion, Protestantism, Puritanism, Catholicism, and you can't talk about new governments, about succession, who's going to be the next King or Queen of England. She said that no monarch fit to rule would ever allow something so stupid. No monarch who is a good monarch in any sense of the word would not be so dumb to allow you guys to talk about whatever you want. Got it? And that's the vibe of this source. The Lord Keeper, he's issuing a reminder that Queen Elizabeth has said on many, many occasions, and he's doing so in a tone that is telling the MPs to fall in line and do their jobs. So when we're looking at the accuracy of the source, we have to ask ourselves the following question. What was the role of Parliament? Using our own knowledge, we know their job was to say yes and no to laws. It was to raise taxes. It wasn't to talk about religion or governments. And we have to compare it to our source. If these two match up, we've got an accurate source. If they don't match, our source is not accurate. So go ahead and have a moment to think before we move along about the accuracy of this source. Does it make sense based on what you know? Great, so just a little bit more practice before we attempt that question and then have a sample answer appear. Let's look at something we know more about. We know a lot about Mary, Queen of Scots. So this is a letter written by William Cecil to Elizabeth I on the 16th of October, 1569. And he's saying some pretty interesting things here. He's saying the Queen of Scots, so in other words, Mary, Queen of Scots, is and always shall be a dangerous person to your estate. That means to your kingdom, to you, to your safety. But there are degrees of danger. If she is kept a prisoner, it will be less. If at liberty, greater. What William Cecil is saying here, that Mary is always going to be a problem to you and your safety, but there are different degrees of danger that she will cause. If you let Mary out of jail, running around free, she's going to be a big, big problem for you. If at liberty, the threat will be great. If she's kept in prison, the threat will be less. But there's something that William Cecil isn't saying. He's hiding something within his text. He's planting an idea in the mind of Elizabeth. It's almost as though there's some text missing right about here. It's almost as though he's saying, if you keep her in jail, she'll be less of a threat. If you let her free, she'll be a big threat. And if you do this, she will not be a threat at all. And we can see that William Cecil is starting to infer that Elizabeth should consider executing Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, some important points for us to consider when we're looking at our strengths and limitations is going to be the fact this is a letter. It's written by William Cecil. It's to Elizabeth, and it's in 1569. So go ahead and pause the video and have a think about what Cecil said. Think about the possible strengths and the limitations of this source, both the content and its authorship. So just have a think about those, and then we'll walk you through how we find them together. So looking at our strengths of the source, there are a few that we can identify. So we know that William Cecil is the longest serving Privy Councillor, and you don't get to be the longest serving Privy Councillor if you're not good at your job. So clearly Cecil was very good at providing advice, and that's why he was on the Privy Council for over 40 years. So it's a good thing. He's a very well-respected Privy Councillor. The things that he tells Elizabeth are often going to be very useful to her. The advice he's providing is good advice. She wants to keep him around. He's clearly a supporter of the Queen. He's trying to keep her safe. He's saying that Mary's a threat to you and your safety. We need to look out for you, Elizabeth. And it's a letter. Letters are private. If William Cecil wanted other Privy Councillors to know about this, he would talk about it in the Privy Chamber with them, but it's clearly a secret issue. It's not for all people to discuss. Cecil might not know who was kind of on the side of Elizabeth and who's spying for the Spanish or who's spying for the Catholics. So he's going to be very careful and try to keep this as quiet for as long as possible. Now, sometimes the limitations are a bit harder for us to find. Now, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, why is he telling this to Elizabeth in the first place? And some of us might think, he's trying to save the Queen to keep her alive. But what are his motivations? Imagine if Elizabeth is murdered by Catholic plotters and Mary, Queen of Scots, becomes the next Queen of England. Who's going to be the first person fired from the Privy Council? Well, it's going to be William Cecil. He's a Protestant. So is he trying to save his own career by keeping the Queen alive? Or is he doing this solely for the good of the Queen? What are his beliefs? So we know he's a Protestant, so what's he going to think of someone like Mary who's a Catholic? Is this influencing his opinions? If he was a Puritan, would he advocate for the murder of Mary, Queen of Scots? Or is this something he's doing because he's a Protestant? Again, we know he doesn't say murder Mary, Queen of Scots. He's not allowed to say that. He can't tell Elizabeth what to do, but he can advise her. And he's hiding that advice within his statement. And the last is for us to consider what he really wants and why doesn't he just come out and say it? If William Cecil were to say to Elizabeth, murder Mary, well, there's going to be a little bit of a problem. He's not allowed to tell the Queen what to do. He's only allowed to provide his advice. So I do hope that this helped us a little bit in walking through and finding the strengths and limitations. We're going to flash back to our practice question, and you'll be able to do that in your exercise books. After you do the practice question, keep playing the video. You'll see the model answer. Just compare the structure and make sure that you hit relatively the same points of information and historical evidence. Great, so here we are, we're back to our question again. So keep in mind the advice previously given. Make sure you're following your paragraph structure. So start off with your judgment, talk about how this accurately reflects the views of MPs, and explain why, set the context. Strengths and limitations refer to what is good and not so good about the authorship, keeping in mind this is coming directly from the Queen, but it's coming through the Lord Keeper, and it's his reply. Maybe we want to know something about what Parliament requested in the first place. And your final judgment, just reiterate that clear judgment a second time. So pause the video now, use the source, answer the question, and the question is here halfway down. It says, to what extent does source C accurately reflect the views that MPs do not have total freedom of speech? So you have to say whether you fully agree, so whether this is fully accurate, somewhat accurate, or not accurate, and make sure we're following that structure. When you're finished writing, you can go ahead and resume playing the video, and a sample answer should appear at the end of this video lesson.
Source C is accurate in showing that MPs did not have freedom of speech in Parliament, as they were limited to the topics they could discuss. The source says that MPs were allowed to debate laws, but were not allowed to talk about religion, succession or marriage, topics that the Queen feared could cause disruption and rebellion. The source is strengthened by its authorship, as the Lord Keeper's job was to represent the Queen in Parliament and would be responsible for sharing her messages with the MPs. I know that the Queen did not allow her MPs to talk about these issues in an attempt to keep tighter control over Parliament due to the constant religious issues between the Puritans, Protestants, and Catholics. One limitation is the fact we do not know what the Lord Keeper is replying to. It would be useful to know what the request for freedom of speech was, and who made this request. I know that Peter Wentworth and Anthony Cope were imprisoned for attempting to change the religious settlement, and it does seem reasonable they were imprisoned for doing this. However, if the Lord Keeper's reply is made to request to discuss the succession of Elizabeth due to her having no children, it may help to show Elizabeth had little tolerance for her MPs to have any freedom of speech. A further limitation is knowing if the Lord Keeper has issued this reply in the same way, using the same words as the Queen, or if it was changed slightly. Source C is accurate in showing that MPs had a limit as to what they could discuss. True freedom of speech would mean they could discuss all issues facing England, and not be limited to only passing bills. As this source comes representative and shows the limitations set out for MPs,